Hello there, traveler of the late night. Have you turned off all the lights yet? Pull the curtains closed and leave the noisy, frantic world out. Side the window, right now, it's just you, me, and the gentle darkness settling over the room. Lie down, let the weight slide off your shoulders, take a deep breath in, and exhale slowly. Do you hear it? Maybe it's just the steady whir of a fan, or the soft patter of rain against the eaves. But if you listen closely, truly listen, you will hear the sound of waves, not today's waves, but waves from 600 years ago crashing against the cliffs of an ancient continent. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere full of contradictions. Imagine this: how could a narrow, barren strip of land perched on the far edge of the civilized world, what many believed was the very end of life itself, rise to become the master of the oceans? How could a kingdom so poor its royal family couldn't afford wheat possibly build a gilded empire, stretching from the tropical forests of Brazil to the sacred temples of Japan? How could a nation of barely 1 million souls dare to set sail into the darkness, into places on the map marked only with the words, "Here be dragons"? The story tonight isn't just history. It's an epic of reckless courage, of terror staring into the abyss, and of a burning desire to touch the horizon. Before we begin our journey back through time, if this voice is bringing you even the slightest feeling of calm, go ahead and gently tap the like button or subscribe, just so we don't lose each other in this vast ocean of people. And tell me, where are you listening from right now? What time is it? Whatever the hour, it's time to close your eyes, let our imagination drift upward, over rooftops, past the clouds, until it lands on a windswept, rocky shore. Welcome to the beginning of the age of discovery. From the cliffs of the Atlantic to the dream of Prince Henry. The day the sun rose in the west, our story begins on a grey morning, August 14th, 1415. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a massive wooden ship, heaving violently on the white carpeted waters off North Africa. The sting of salt hits your nose, mixed with the sweat of thousands of men holding their breath. In front of you lies Ceuta, a proud Muslim city on the Mediterranean, known as the key to the Strait of Gibraltar. Its ochre walls glow in the morning sun, magnificent yet menacing. On the bow of the flagship stands a young man, motionless. He is 21 years old, with a solemn face and deep, focused eyes. The sea wind whips his hair and flutters the cloak bearing the bright red cross on his chest. This is Prince Henrique, the third son of the King of Portugal, the man whom history would later crown with a legendary title, Henry the Navigator. But here's the twist and irony almost no one talks about: the man celebrated as the greatest navigator couldn't swim. He never sailed far from shore, never steered a ship through a great storm, never took command on the open sea. He was a prince of the land, a dreamer in a library, a monk disguised as a warrior, and yet it was the quiet fire in his soul that sparked the storms that would rewrite the world's maps forever. That day, 45,000 Portuguese soldiers stormed the beaches of Ceuta. Steel clashed, screams filled the sky. Cannon fire shattered centuries of North African peace. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. King João I and his sons had emptied the national treasury. For this assault, failure meant collapse. Portugal, devoured by powerful Castile. But they didn't fail. Ceuta fell in a single day. A breathtaking, impossible victory. At sunset, as the sky and sea burned red, Henrique walked into the conquered city. He passed through narrow Arab alleyways, over corpses, over smoldering ruins. Strange scents from the plundered warehouses, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, flooded his senses for the first time. Intoxicating and mysterious, he stopped at the Grand Mosque, now being hurriedly consecrated into a Christian church. Inside, the cool, shadowed silence contrasted starkly with the furnace outside. Candlelight flickered across intricate carvings. And there he saw them, not gold, not jewels, maps. Arab maps of a world Europe had never seen while. European charts ended at the Sahara. These maps showed Africa stretching far, far south, like a ribbon without end. They showed great rivers, golden kingdoms, and most important, why? Caravan routes across the desert. Enrique knelt on the cold stone floor, his shoulders trembled. He wept not from victory, but from awe. A new horizon had opened before him in his mind, a wild idea took root, one that would consume the rest of his life. He whispered into the vaulted hall. God has given us a door, now we must find the key. From that day on, he knew his purpose. He returned to Portugal, but not to the glittering palace life of Lisbon. He chose solitude. He withdrew to Sagres, a barren promontory at the far southwest corner of Europe, where sheer cliffs plunge into the aging Atlantic. To medieval minds, Sagres was finis terrae, the end of the world. Sail further, they said, and the sea simply ends, dropping into a dark abyss filled with monsters waiting to devour the bold. The winds were so fierce that trees bent permanently, like beggars bowing before nature's wrath. There, on that harsh edge of civilization, Enrique built his headquarters. Later legends painted it as a school of Sagres with classrooms and chalkboards, but the truth was far more poetic and far harsher. It wasn't a school, it was a monastery for dreamers and madman henna. Iquay gathered brilliant and eccentric minds, Jewish cartographers, Arab astronomers, hardened sailors who had survived tempests. For 40 years, he poured every coin he had, inheritance, church tiff, even money from selling knighthoods, into one obsession, building ships and redrawing the world. He lived in a stone tower lashed by wind, staring at the dark Atlantic, listening to the roaring G-waves like whispers from ancient souls. He never married, had no children. His only lover was the ocean. His only child, the hunger to explore. Each year he sent ships a little south, down Africa's coast, inch by inch, year after year. They returned with maps of new shores, though many never returned at all. Swallowed by the merciless sea, the Portuguese grew resentful. They deemed him a fool, a reckless spender, a man throwing money into the ocean. Enrique ignored them. He lived like an ascetic, simple clothes, strict discipline, but eyes burning with unquenchable fire. He died in 1460, alone in his cold stone chamber, bankrupt, never seeing his dream fulfilled, never seeing India, Brazil, or the Golden Empire built from the foundation he laid. But he left something greater than treasure, a dream that the world was larger than believed, and that the sea wasn't a barrier but a bridge. He planted a seed on that barren cliff, and soon it would grow into a colossal tree shading the world. If Enrique was the soul of exploration, then the ships were its body. But European ships in the early 1400s were clumsy beasts, huge, slow, with square sails, helpless against the wind. The Atlantic was no gentle Mediterranean. It was a wild creature, with vicious currents and shifting winds to conquer it. The Portuguese needed something new. They didn't invent the compass, they borrowed it from China. They didn't invent astronomical tools, they learned them from Arabs. They didn't invent gunpowder, their genius was combining all these borrowed pieces into one masterpiece. The caravel. Imagine a small ship, under 25 meters long, less than 100 tons. Not majestic, not intimidating, almost laughable beside the Venetian giants. It looked like a walnut shell tossed on the waves, but don't be fooled, the caravel was the spaceship of the 15th century. Its secret lay in its triangular lateen sails. With these, it could zigzag against the wind, something no European fleet had managed before. It could slip through storms, ride over violent waves, and turn on a dime like a dolphin. Its rounded hull withstood the Atlantic's pounding. Its low sides let sailors repair it on any beach. Inside, the smell of pitch, oak, and salt filled its tiny belly, the smell of long voyages on these humble wooden horses. The Portuguese challenged nature itself. In 1488, 28 years after Henrique's death, Bartolomeu Dias made history. He led to caravels and a supply ship farther south than any human had gone. His voyage was a nightmare. The farther south they went, the angrier the seas became. Waves like mountains smashed the tiny ships. The wind howled like a choir of restless ghosts. Days and nights blurred into endless grey. The crew panicked. They begged Dias to turn back. They believed they were sailing into hell. Then came a storm that lasted 13 days. The ships were blown far from shore, drifting blindly in the endless sea. When it finally calmed, Dias headed east to find land, but they found nothing. Only water. Then a realization struck him. If Africa wasn't to the east, they must have passed its southern tip. He ordered the ships north, and then, at last land, he had done it. He had rounded the barrier dividing Europe from Asia. He named the Cape Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms, a name filled with terror. But when he returned to Lisbon, King João II shook his head. Words have power. Who would dare sail to a place led the Cape of Storms? So the king renamed it Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope, because he knew the door was open. India was no longer a dream if Dias opened the door. Vasco da Gama kicked it down. 9 years later, on July 8, 1497, Lisbon's harbour witnessed an unimaginable sight. For ships Snow Gabriel, Snow Rafael, Berrio, and the supply ship Odd to depart, crowds wept as if sending loved ones to execution. They believed none would return. Vasco da Gama, the commander, was a hard man, brutal, loyal, unromantic. He boarded with 170 sailors, many of them criminals, spared execution only to join this death voyage. Instead of hugging Africa's coast, da Gama gambled. He sailed deep into the Atlantic to catch the trade winds. For 93 days they saw nothing but water and sky. 93 days of drifting in a void, a record unmatched until Captain Cook centuries later. Scurvy stalked the ships, gums swelled and bled, old wounds reopened, limbs ached, the smell of rot, spoiled water, and mouldy food choked the caravels. Groans filled the dark lower decks, but da Gama refused to break. Through sheer iron will and cruelty, when did he force the fleet past the Cape of Good Hope, Africa's east coast, and finally, with the help of a skilled Arab navigator, across the Indian Ocean. May 20, 1498, a day carved in to history. The anchor of the Snow Gabriel dropped outside Calicut, the richest port in southern India. After a century of fumbling in the dark, the Portuguese had found the Holy Grail. Before them stretched a dazzling world, unlike Europe's grey poverty. Calicut was impossibly wealthy, filled with merchants from Arabia, China, Persia. Spices perfumed the air, the scent of money itself. When the local ruler, the Zamorin, met da Gama, he asked simply, "What have you come to seek?" Da Gama's answer became the motto of an era. "We come for Christians and spices." He found the spices: pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves worth their weight in gold. In Europe were piled like ordinary produce in the markets, but he found no Christians. Worse, the gifts he brought, wool cloth, hats, barrels of honey, were pathetic beside India's wealth. Arab merchants mocked him. The Zamorin looked down on him. The Portuguese were seen as beggars from a poor, far-flung land. The humiliation burned da Gama's soul. He realized that in this world, the only law respected was the canon. Commerce and war were inseparable. If they wouldn't sell spices, he would take them by force. Before leaving, da Gama left a bloody farewell. He kidnapped fishermen, bombarded the city, and most horrifyingly cut off the ears and noses of Indian envoys, stitched dog ears in their place, and sent them back to the Zamorin. His message: "We will return, and next time, we won't come to negotiate." The return journey was even worse. Monsoon winds trapped them, disease ravaged tea. The crews, da Gama burned the snow Raphael because too few men remained to sail her. When they finally staggered back to Lisbon in 1499, only 55 of the original 170 were alive. But the tattered ships carried acts of spices. When sold, they yielded a profit of 6,000%, a number so insane it blinds the mind. Lisbon exploded with excitement. King Manuel I proclaimed himself with a thunderous title, Lord and King of Portugal, the Algarve, both sides of Guinea, and of the conquest, navigation, and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. Imagine it, a tiny kingdom of 1.5 million people, poor and short on manpower, suddenly declaring itself master of half the globe. They didn't know they were beginning the age of discovery, a turning point for all humanity. They only knew the wines had changed. The trade wines once feared had become allies, filling the sails emblazoned with the Red Cross, pushing Portugal's destiny forward. It's late now, and our story of this hard but glory, us beginning, must pause here, from the desolate cliffs of Sagres, where Prince Henry stared into the sea, to the bustling, blood-scented ports of India. The Portuguese had travelled an unimaginable path. The why had unlocked the world's treasure door. But unlocking is one thing, keeping the treasure is another. How could such a small nation hope to rule an entire ocean? How did they build humanity's first global maritime empire with nothing but wood, wind, and bottomless ambition? And what price did they pay for their golden century? How much blood did it cost? A golden century, when Portugal was the sun of the world. Afonso de Albuquerque, the man who died because he could not go home. If Vasco da Gama was the spear that pierced the darkness to find a way forward, then the man I am about to tell you about was the fortress, built in the middle of the ocean to keep that path alive. His name was Afonso de Albuquerque. History calls him the Lion of the Seas, the Caesar of the East, but to his enemies at the time, that name meant the most terrifying nightmare imaginable. In 1503, Albuquerque boarded a ship bound for India. He came from a poor noble family, wet out vast lands back home. Perhaps it was precisely that poverty that forged in him a cold, ruthless ambition. Standing on the ship's deck, staring toward the eastern horizon, he whispered a fateful vow: if I cannot have land in Portugal, then I will make the entire Indian Ocean my home. And he did not speak in vain. Albuquerque's thinking was a century ahead of his time. While other kings only thought about trading for profit, Albuquerque understood that commerce could not survive without power. He did not want Portugal to be a begging merchant. He wanted Portugal to hold the keys to every door. Within a mere 12 years, from 1503 to 1515, with a force so small it was almost laughable, fewer than 20,000 soldiers scattered across Asia, he carried out a mad plan to choke the throat of the Muslim world and monopolize the entire spice route. Imagine the map of the Indian Ocean as a vast house. Albuquerque seized its doors one by one. In 1507, he attacked Hormuz, an arid island, but the key to controlling the Persian Gulf. The battle was so brutal that people said the water around the island turned red with blood for days. After capturing the city, he forced prisoners to build a fortress under the scorching sun, declaring that the Portuguese had come to stay forever. In 1510, he took Goa, a prosperous city on India's west coast. He turned Goa into the capital of the East, a second Lisbon where church bells drowned out the chants of Hindu temples. Goa became the heart, the pulse of the empire for the next 450 years, and in 1511, he sailed east to Malacca, the place known as the throat of Southeast Asia, where every ship from China or Japan passing toward India had to go through. Malacca fell. With this victory, Portugal seized the spice trade at its very roots. But the most terrifying and genius aspect of Albuquerque was not his military brilliance, it was his vision of people. He looked at his tiny army, at the vast ocean, and he knew the Portuguese would never be numerous enough to rule this land. They would wither away from disease, war, and loneliness. So he issued a decree that shocked the world, one that struck at the heart of Europe's old moral and religious norms. He encouraged, often forced Portuguese soldiers to marry local women. He declared coldly, "No man shall take an Indian wife of Hindu or Muslim faith and allow her to keep her religion, baptize them, marry them, and let them bear children." His goal was not love, it was politics. He sought to create a new race, a mixed Eurasian people who spoke Portuguese, worshipped Christianity, but were born and raised in the tropics. They would become the claws that rooted deeply into this land, loyal to Lisbon Beck. Else they belonged nowhere else. Albuquerque was the father of what we now call biological colonialism. Yet the fate of great men is often tinged with tragedy. In 1515, his enemies at court whispered venom into the ear of King Manuel I the king, fearful that Albuquerque's power might overshadow the throne, recalled him and replaced him with his greatest rival. The news reached Albuquerque as he was sailing back to Goa from Hormuz. He was old and sick by then. When he learned he had been dismissed, the iron-hearted man cried out in anguish, "I serve the king with all my heart, and the people hate me. I seek to please the people, and the king suspects me enough. Let me go to my grave." He never set foot on land again. He died at sea, off the coast of Goa, in a cramped cabin filled with maps and the scent of spices. Before taking his final breath, he asked to be dressed in the habit of the Order of Santiago. They buried him in India, just as he wished. "I belong to the sea, not the land." The lion of the seas was dead, but his roar still echoes across the oceans. An empire without borders, only stopping points. After Albuquerque's death, Portugal entered the height of its power, the era history calls the Golden Century. But this was a strange empire, one that you would hardly recognize on a traditional map. It was nothing like the Roman Empire with its vast, continuous lands, nor like the Mongol Empire, whose horses thundered across endless plains. The Portuguese Empire was a spiderweb, an invisible network tightening around the globe. By 1550, Portugal controlled a chain of colonies and trading posts stretching from Brazil in the west, around Africa, to India, Southeast Asia, and even Japan. They owned Brazil, discovered in 1500, where endless forests of redwood promised inexhaustible resources. They controlled Angola and Mozambique in Africa, suppliers of humanity's darkest commodity, slaves. They ruled Hormuz, Goa, Malacca, Macau, the gateways into mainland China. And in 1543, a storm carried 3 Portuguese men to Tanegashima, making them the first Europeans to reach Japan, bringing with them arquebuses and Jesus Christ to the land of the cherry blossoms. They did not need to conquer vast territories. The Portuguese understood that occupying land required governing people, which was expensive and dangerous. They only needed to seize the pressure points, narrow straits all ships had to pass, great river mouths, deep and safe harbors. They built a chain of fortresses of coral stone, antique wood, stubborn and impregnable, along the coasts. These fortresses served as warehouses, barracks and churches all at once. This system was called the Estado da India, the state of India. But the name was misleading, for 99% of that state lay outside India. It floated on water. Its borders were the horizon. Its territory was the deck of a ship. Its citizens were sailors, merchants, mercenaries, and missionaries. The empire functioned like a colossal money machine. In spring, the southwest monsoon carried ships from Africa to India. In autumn, the northeast monsoon carried them back. The Portuguese simply rode the winds, bringing silver from Japan to trade for Chinese silk, bringing that silk to trade for Indonesian spices, bringing those spices to India in exchange for textiles, and finally hauling everything back to Lisbon in exchange for gold. They monopolized the global spice trade for 100 years. Imagine this, every peppercorn dropped into a German housewife's oopie, every stick of cinnamon in an English noble's mulled wine passed through Portuguese hands and paid tax to the Portuguese king. It was soft power with the weight of a mountain, even when disaster struck in 1580 when young King Sebastião died in North Africa without an heir, leaving the Portuguese crown to Spain's King Philip II. The empire lived on. It lived because it no longer depended on Lisbon. It had become a self-sustaining organism. It lived by the breath of the monsoons, by the blood of enslaved Africans, by the scent of sandalwood and the fire of Malabar pepper. Spain might wear the crown, but Portugal still owned the sea. Lisbon 1550, the richest city in Europe. Now let us return to the beginning. Let us leave the humid tropical seas and go back to Lisbon. In the mid-16th century, if you stood in Lisbon in 1550, you would be overwhelmed. From a dull little town of 50,000 on Europe's edge, Lisbon had swollen into a massive metropolis of 200,000. It was larger than Paris, busier than London, and richer than any other city on the continent. The White Tagus River was always packed with ships. Forests of masts were so dense that people said you could walk from one riverbank to the other by stepping from deck to deck. Each year, hundreds of caravels and massive carracks arrived, their bellies heavy with treasures from the east. Each voyage brought in staggering profits. The king's annual spice revenue reached millions of cruzados, more than the entire budget of France combined. Wealth overflowed through the streets. The Royal Ribera Palace rose in splendor on the river bank, its floors paved with granite from Brazil and marble from Italy. At royal feasts, people ate off gold plates and drank from silver cups cast from Mexican ore. One famous story claimed that in the warehouses of the Casa da India, the royal trading office, pepper was so abundant it spilled onto the streets. Chickens pecked at fallen pecans and died from the heat. The scent of spices hung over the entire city, seeping into wood, clothes, and skin. Lisbon became a living museum of wonders. You could see black slaves from Guinea carrying litters for noblewomen, Japanese merchants in kimonos walking the streets, and brightly colored macaw parrots from the Amazon perched on sailors' shoulders, and most notably, King Joe II. I owned an Indian elephant named Hanno, the first elephant seen in Europe since Rome's fall. Hanno paraded through the streets and was even gifted by the king to the Pope as a symbol of Portuguese supremacy. When Hanno knelt before the Pope, all of Europe bowed before Portugal, but beneath the splendor, shadows crept. Lisbon's wealth was built not only on gold and spice, but also on slavery. About 10% of the city's population were African slaves. The empire's riches were laid on the backs of the enslaved. The filthy, cramped neighborhoods of Alfama, where crippled sailors awaited death, stood in stark contrast to the palaces. Luxury. The Portuguese were drunk on victory. They spent extravagantly, despised manual labor as the work of slaves, and neglected agriculture and domes. Tick production. They believed that everything they needed could be taken from the sea. They did not know they were eating away their own future. My friend, we have just walked through the brightest moment of an empire, a century when the sun seemed never to set on the domains of the Portuguese king. From a poor kingdom, they became the center of the universe, where all the world's wealth and goods converged. They had few people, no vast natural resources, no mighty armies. They had only the sea, the monsoon winds, and an ambition larger than the ocean. That ambition carried them to glory, but it was also quietly digging their grave, because no sun stays at its zenith forever. The laws of nature are cruel. After the peak comes decline. The moment you reach the highest and is the moment you begin to descend. New enemies were already appearing on the horizon. Dutch and English ships, with stronger cannons and ambitions just as great, were eyeing the sweet cake Portugal held. How would this empire of spice and blood withstand the storm to come? And is the mournful fado we hear today born from the foreboding of that downfall, the longest sunset and the death in the voice of fado, 158-016 for 060 years of Spanish captivity? The story of decline begins not with the sound of gunfire, but with a promise. In 1580, the throne of Portugal stood empty. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful man in Europe at the time, placed upon his head the crown of his neighbor. He stood before the Portuguese nobility and swore, "I will rule Portugal as a separate kingdom, 2 crowns, 1 head, but 2 hearts." He promised to protect Portugal's trading empire. He promised that the sun would never set, but alas, the promises of kings are often as fragile as morning mist. In reality, when Portugal was absorbed into Spain, it inherited not just a new king, but also all of Spain's enemies, and the greatest, most dangerous enemies at the time were the Dutch merchants and the English fleet. If the Portuguese were romantic knights who saw seafaring as a crusade for God, then the Dutch and the English were cold-blooded businessmen who cared nothing for salvation. They cared only about balance sheets and net profit. They founded the world's first joint stock companies, the Dutch East India Company (VOC) and the English East India Company (OIC). These were war machines fueled by shareholder money, more ruthless and more efficient than any royal army. And thus the carving up began. Imagine you are an aging Portuguese soldier stationed at the fortress of Hormuz in 1622. You look out to the sea, once your home, and see English ships with superior firepower approaching. Hormuz falls, the gateway to the Persian Gulf slams shut before the Portuguese. Then in 1630, on the opposite side of the world, the Dutch attack Recife in Brazil. They seized the vast sugar plantations that once entered money for Lisbon, and most painful of all was 1641, when Malacca, the jewel of Southeast Asia, the place where Afonso de Albuquerque had spilled oceans of blood to conquer, fell into Dutch hands. Losing Malacca was losing the throat. The spice route was cut. Throughout those 60 years, Portugal was like a giant bound hand and foot, helplessly watching its children taken away on by one. Its resources were sucked dry by the Spanish king to fuel meaningless wars in Europe. The once proud Portuguese fleets now rotted on the seafloor or burned in their own harbors, yet the blood of explorers had not completely cooled. On December 1, 1640, on a bleak winter morning in Lisbon, a group of 40 Portuguese nobles, unable to bear the humiliation any longer, stormed the palace, overthrew the Spanish regent, and tossed her secretary out the window into the square below. It was a nearly bloodless coup, but it awakened an entire nation. They elevated the Duke of Braganza to the throne as King João IV. Portugal regained its independence, but when João IV looked upon his realm, what did he see? The Eastern Spice Empire shattered, the fortresses in India reduced to isolated outposts, the maritime Silk Road seized by the Dutch and English. The Eastern dream had ended. Yet, as if fate itself always watched over this small nation, when one door closed, another opened. The Portuguese Empire did not die, it merely changed direction. It turned its back on the aging Indian Ocean and faced the immense land that still leapt across the Atlantic, Brazil. The 18th century, the empire of Brazilian gold and slaves. In the late 17th century, when Portugal teetered on the brink of bankruptcy, an obscure band of frontiersmen known as the Bandeirantes, the flag bearers, ventured deep into Brazil's wild interior. They sought native peoples to enslave, but instead they found something else glittering beneath the dark mud of the streams in Minas Gerais. Gold, not small nuggets, but the largest gold deposits the world had ever seen. And soon after came diamonds. The news reached Lisbon like a downpour. Over a desert, a gold rush erupted. Throughout the 18th century, Brazil provided up to 50% of the world's total gold supply. Tons upon tons of pure gold crossed the Atlantic and deported into Lisbon. Portugal suddenly became wealthy, again richer even than during the spice trade era. King João V, known as the Sun King of Portugal, used that gold to build Baroque marvels of breathtaking opulence. If you visit Lisbon today and step into Snow Road Church, you will see chapels gilded in gold from floor to ceiling. That is Brazilian gold. The library of Coimbra University, the colossal Mafra Palace, all were built with gold, but behind that dazzling brilliance lay a vast darkness. To extract that gold, the Portuguese needed manpower, and they created the largest forced migration in human history. Over 4 million Africans, men, women, and children were kidnapped from Angola and Mozambique, packed into filthy, cramped slave ships, and shipped to Brazil. They lived and died in dark mines, their average life expectancy only a few years after arriving. Every brick in Lisbon squares, every gilded statue in its churches, was soaked with the sweat and the blood of those nameless souls. The wealth of gold also created a tragic paradox for Portugal. Because they had so much gold, they no longer needed to develop industry. They bought everything: clothes from England, wheat from France, weapons from Germany. Gold flowed into Lisbon and then flowed right back out to pay for goods, turning Portugal into a funnel through which Europe's wealth passed, while the Portuguese people remained poor and uneducated. Then a natural catastrophe descended like a warning from God. On November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, an enormous earthquake, followed by a tsunami and fires, leveled Lisbon. 2/3 of the city was destroyed. Tens of thousands died in church during Mass. But thanks to Brazilian gold, Lisbon rose from the ashes. Pombo, a stern and iron-fisted statesman, rebuilt the city with the broad avenues and grand squares that stand today. The new Lisbon was more beautiful and modern, but it carried the tragic beauty of a phoenix reborn from flames, fed by gold and blood. 1807, the day the sun set in. That golden empire finally came to an end, not because its resources ran dry, but because of a political storm from the north, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1807, the French army invaded Portugal. Napoleon wanted to erase the small kingdom from the map for defying his continental system. The French advanced like a storm, only days away from Lisbon. In that desperate moment, the Portuguese royal family made a decision unprecedented in European history, both insane and brilliant. They moved the capital to their colony, November 27th, 1887. Lisbon's harbour was chaos under a torrent of rain. Winds howled as if trying to tear the sails apart. The entire court, king, queen, princes, princesses, officials, bishops, the royal treasury, the vast library of 60,000 books, even the minting presses, all 15,000 people crowded onto 60 warships and merchant vessels. The people of Lisbon stood on the shore drenched, weeping as their rulers fled. Queen Maria I, long since driven mad, screamed as she was carried aboard, "Don't go so fast. People will think we are running away." But she was wrong. They were running away. The fleet set sail just as Napoleon's cavalry appeared on the hills overlooking Lisbon. They escaped by minutes. After 2 months at sea, battered by storms, lice, and lack of fresh water, the convoy reached Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and then a miracle happened. Rio de Janeiro, once a sleepy colonial town, suddenly became the capital of the entire Portuguese Empire. For the first and only time in history, a European kingdom was ruled from the New World. King João VI loved Brazil so deeply that even after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, he refused to return to Lisbon. He elevated Brazil to L status with Portugal, but history has its inevitable turns. In 1821, pressured by revolution at home, João VI reluctantly left Brazil for Lisbon. Before departing, he appointed his eldest son, Prince Dom Pedro, as regent of Brazil. He embraced his son and whispered a prophecy, "Pedro, if Brazil must separate, let it separate under your hand. Who will respect me, rather than fall into the hands of adventurers?" That prophecy came true just 1 year later. On September 7, 1822, by the Ipiranga River, Dom Pedro, the heir to the Portuguese throne, drew his sword and shouted the slogan, "Independence or death." He tore the Portuguese insignia from his uniform and declared Brazil an independent empire. In that moment, the Portuguese empire truly died. Losing Brazil was losing everything. Its heart, its lungs, its treasury. Portugal was left with scattered fragments in Africa and Asia: Macau, Timor, Goa, Angola, Mozambique. These fragments were held for more than another century, but the brilliant glow had faded. The sun had set in the west, where it had once been promised it would shine forever. Our story now reaches its end. The Portuguese Empire, from a barren cliff, had stretched across the seas to embrace the world, only to shrink back to that same cliff. It completed a great circle of fate. Today, if you walk through the winding alleys of Lisbon's Alfam, a district at nightfall, you will hear fado rising from small taverns. It is a strange, heart-wrenching music, sung by women dressed in black, accompanied by a 12-string guitar that wails like the ocean. The Portuguese have a word that no other language can fully translate: saudade. It is not just longing. It is the emptiness for something beautiful that has been lost and will never return. Fado is the soul of saudade. When you listen to fado, you will understand that the Portuguese do not sing about failure. They sing about tragic pride. They sing of sailors who never returned, wives waiting at the harbor of a time when Lisbon was queen of the seas. They accept their decline with grace and nostalgia. They know they once stood on top of the world, once dared to achieve the impossible, and that is enough. And if one day you stand on the cliffs of Sagres at sunset, the place where our story began, look out over the vast ocean. The wind still blows as fiercely as it did 600 years ago. The waves still crash against the rocks with a roar. Perhaps, just perhaps, within that wind, you will hear the whispers of Prince Henry, the cheers of Vasco da Gama's crew upon sighting India, and the sighs of old soldiers in Malacca. They are gone. The empire has crumbled, but their dream, the dream of connecting the world, still lives in every intercontinental fleet, every massive container ship cutting through the waves, and even in the pepper-spiced coffee you might drink tomorrow morning. It is very late now. Let go of thoughts of rise and fall. Everything in this world will pass. Only peaceful sleep is precious at this hour. Thank you for drifting with me down the river of time over these past 3 nights. I hope the story of those great and wonderly pioneers has brought you a spark of inspiration and, more than anything, a sense of calm in your heart. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a peaceful night's sleep well, and dream of white sails dissolving quietly into the horizon.